Hello everyone, greeting from Jakarta. It's me, Visal, from ASEAN Center for Energies, and I am very happy to welcome you all to our sixth webinars that we organized this year in June. Today we have a discussion on what new in ASEAN renewable energy financing. This is brought to you by ASEAN Center for Energies. First of all, my name is Visal Veng. I am a senior officer energy research analyst in the Policy Research Analytic Program. I will be a moderator in this webinar discussions. Before we start our webinar discussions, I'm very pleased to give you a brief introductions about our institutions. ASEAN Center for Energies. We are an independent intergovernmental organization within the associations of Southeast Asian nations structures that represents the interests of the 10 ASEAN member states in the energy sectors. We are under the guideline document, what I call it ASEAN Plans of Action for Energy Corporations. The 7 program areas of ASEAN Plans of Action for Energy Cooperation, APEC 2016 until 2025 are 1. ASEAN Power Grids, 2. Trans-ASEAN Gas Pipeline, 3. Coal and Clean Coal Technology, 4. Energy Efficiency and Conservation, 5. Renewable Energy, 6. Regional Energy Policy and Planning, and 7. Civilian Nuclear Energies. ASEAN Center for Energy as an institution has been endorsed by the 10 ASEAN member states and play a role as a think tank, catalyst, and service data and knowledge hub to provide depositories for energy development in ASEAN. For the introductions of these webinars, every month we regularly conduct joint studies, policy dialogues, and capacity buildings. One of our activities that we regularly conduct is an online webinars that we are conducting today. We have our webinar collaboration with our experts from an international energy agencies. They are also from private and public sectors. We do our webinar regularly 2 to 3 p.m. every month Jakarta time. So if you would like to follow us, please follow us next month as scheduled. For the objective and expected outcome of these webinars is to encourage discussions on energy sectors and renewable energy financing in ASEAN. The objective is also to share and exchange information with the involvement of policymakers, private sectors, academias, and multi-stakeholder discussion platform. For the agenda today, the duration of our webinars is 1 hour. Today we will have 2 speakers and 1 panelist. Each speakers will have approximately 10 minutes to share their experiences and expertise on the topic. After our speaker presentation, the panelists will lead the discussion and Q&A session. During these sessions, online audiences could also ask questions to our speakers through the chats or question panels. And finally, we will conclude our webinars from 3 to 3:05 p.m. So joining with me today in our webinars, first I would like to present to you Mr. Rob Henderson, former chief academist at economist at National Australian Banks. He has a lot of experiences. He is a banking, financial market, and policy economist with over 40 years of experience, including at the Federal Department of Finance and Prime Minister and Cabinet, investment and corporate banking, and heading up the economic strategy team on NAB global trading floors. During his work, Rob has made numerous media appearances and has written hundreds of reports and submissions on topics ranging from the Commonwealth budget, climate change policies, and the outlook for the economies and interest rates. Mr. Rob Henderson holds his Bachelor's of Commerce from University of Newcastle and Master degree of Economics from Australian National University. Mr. Henderson will present to us today about conventional versus renewable, a shift of financing trends. Also joining with us today is our second speakers. I would like to present Mr. Sai Mustafa, Chief Operating Officer at Malaysian Green Technology Corporation, the primary driver for green technology development under the purviews of the Ministry of Energy, Green Technology and Waters, Malaysia. He has more than 30 years of experience in various disciplines in the areas of banking, financing. Mr. Mustafa, since 2011, has devoted himself in promoting green technology deployment for the country. He sat in various national committees, such as the National Steering Committee of the Biomass Power Generations and Co-Generation Projects, the Project Review Committees of Malaysian Building Integrated Photovoltaic Technology Application Projects. Currently, he now directs and oversees the company overall operational policies, initiative, goal in catalyzing the adaptation of green technology for green growth and sustainability. Mr. Mustafa holds a master's degree in International Business Administration from the Lyon International University, San Diego, USA, and a bachelor's degree in Business Administration from Central Michigan University, United States of America. He would like to present to us today about the green sukuk and the difference between bond and sukuk. Besides our speakers, I would like to present our panelists, Ms. Erika Hamdi, who is an energy finance analyst at Institute for Energy Economic and Financial Analyst. Ms. Erika Hamdi has worked on renewable energy, rural electrification, and energy efficiency in Indonesia financial sectors, including the PT Imaging Life Technology, Windrup International, and the Frankfurt School of Finance and Management. Okay, now we will start our discussions by having Mr. Rob Henderson first to talk, and give a time to Mr. Rob Henderson. Mr. Rob Henderson, I will pass to you to start your presentations. Mr. Rob Henderson, the time is yours.
Okay, thank you. I'm just, hopefully you can see my screen now. Everything fine there, Faisal? So I'll start
now. Yes.
Okay, so good afternoon, everybody. And to start with, I'd like to say thank you very much for your introduction, Faisal. And I'd also like to say how much I enjoyed my visit to the ASEAN Centre for Energy back in March of this year, where I visited you in Jakarta. So I'm very glad that you've given me the opportunity again to speak at this webinar. Today, I'd like to talk about trends in the financing of the energy sector. And to do that, I'd just like to set the context by looking at global trends in energy markets to start with, because obviously the key drivers of financial developments relating to energy are pretty much determined by what's happening in energy markets themselves. So I'll spend a little bit of time talking about what's happening in energy markets. I'd like to touch on Australia's energy markets. So some of you may know that Australia is in the process of trying to develop a new energy policy. So I'll touch on that. I won't spend too much time on that. We can come back and talk about that when we move on to questions later on. And then lastly, I'll spend some time talking about how investors are dealing with the transition away from fossil fuels and towards the more renewable, cleaner types of energy. So to start with looking at the key trends in markets, the three things I think which have been very important over the last few years in terms of what's been driving markets for energy are, number one, the Paris Accord, because to me that represented a sea change in policymakers' views about global, really about the global approach to climate change. And one of the corollaries to that is that after the commitments were made at Paris, it wasn't long before prudential and corporate regulators started expressing concerns about how banks and corporate entities were managing the risks that climate change itself was posing to them, but also the risks associated with changes in policies. The other, or the second key trend I wanted to talk about was the cost of renewables and storage. Now, these things are showing quite strong drops in prices, and I think that is a very important background to what's happening in energy markets overall. And one of the consequences of that is that investors are switching out of more aging and mature technologies towards more dynamic businesses. And I'll spend the rest of my time talking about that. So just to start with looking at some of these key trends, here is a chart that shows us what's been happening to the levelized cost of various forms of energy generation. So I'm sure most people on the line here will be aware of the term levelized cost. It's basically designed to look at the underlying costs of various technologies when you take away all the subsidies and taxes that are put upon various types of energy generation methodology. And I think what you can see here is fairly clear that wind and solar are now well below the cost of particularly coal, but also of gas generation. So that's a fairly recent development, as you can see on the chart. This chart is based on US data. So even in the US, you can see here that the levelized cost is lower. And the other thing I'd note, because I know nuclear energy is being discussed in Asia, is the rise in the cost of nuclear power generation relative to the other forms of energy. Now, a very important and even more recent development, I think, is the drop in costs of the storage mechanism for electricity, and that's lithium-ion batteries. So you can see here the chart shows you the drops we've already seen between 2010 and 2016, and the rest of this chart basically, which comes from Bloomberg New Energy Finance, I should add, the rest of this chart shows you what's expected to happen out to 2030. My view is that that is a fairly, that's not a particularly outrageous sort of forecast. I think it's a fairly middle of the road sort of forecast. But even with this forecast, we see that the price per kilowatt hour will drop from about $1,000 in 2010 to about $70 in 2030. That's a 93% fall. And this, I would like to say, is probably the most important chart I'll show you, because this sort of development in storage costs takes away one of the key arguments against the use of renewables. Many people say renewables can't replace baseload because renewables aren't always available. They're intermittent because of the weather. With storage, suddenly they become a much better form or they become a much more reliable form of energy. So this is a very important trend that's happening in energy markets at the moment. With these sorts of developments happening, no surprises that the market share of wind and solar is increasing and increasing fairly steadily. This chart is taken from Goldman Sachs. These people are markets people, so they like to talk in basis points. And what you can see here is their expectations about what will happen in terms of the share of wind and solar in total generation out to 2025. How do you read this chart? Well, you can see there, they say that the average increase is about 106 basis points. So going from 9.7%, what this chart shows you is 106 basis points basically means 10.77% in 2021. So you can see there, they're predicting a steady rise. On the other side of the coin, they themselves asked the question, have we seen a peak in thermal coal consumption? As I said, this is their chart. This is the Goldman's chart. I think the chart's trying to tell us they believe that the peak in coal consumption was back in 2013 already. Note that this is global coal consumption, by the way, for around the world usage of coal. Now, looking at where the money's actually flowing, this chart is from the Frankfurt School. It's interesting to note that you said at the start that Erica had studied at the Frankfurt School, so she can tell you it's a very reputable source. And this is the latest data that I can find on new additions globally to net generation. Obviously, large increases in solar and wind. You can see coal's not dead. 35 gigawatts have been added in coal in 2017, but certainly renewables seem to be now well and truly ahead of the increases in capacity in other types of generation. Over 2/3 of that capacity, around about 68%, is from renewables, and I'm not including nuclear energy in that mix. Now, talking about Australia's energy policy, some of you might know that Australia has a new policy on the table, if you like. The government's proposing something they call the National Energy Guarantee. That National Energy Guarantee incorporates a number of sub-policies. One is an emissions guarantee, so that's basically to reduce emissions in line with Australia's Paris targets for climate change and reductions in carbon pollution. There's also a reliability guarantee, and this is where the batteries come in, because they're saying new installations of renewables must be able to provide dispatchable power. How do you do that? Well, you do that by batteries. Now, sometimes those batteries might be from hydro, but they can also be the lithium-ion batteries that I mentioned before. So this may be a framework for the future. We'll have to see if it gets up. They need ratification by the Australian states before it can, but nonetheless, at the moment, there seems to be a fairly positive view about this between various players in the Australian political sphere. So I'll just move along here now and look at what this means for Australia's energy generation and lending to the various by the various major banks. Australia's got 4 major banks, and you can see there that they are all still lending to fossil fuels, but they're also increasing their lending to less dirty forms of energy generation, so mainly to wind and solar. You can see there that my old employer, National Australia Bank, is probably the best of the banks in terms of the mix between fossil fuels and the others. One last thing I'd point out here is that lots of these fossil fuel investments that are coming through, those fossil fuels investments are not in coal, they're in gas and oil exploration. Now, this shows you the investment by state. There's a bit of variance. All of them have a lot of renewables. You'll see New South Wales has got a lot of hydro. What's that? You may have heard of the new Snowy Hydro scheme. That's what's driving those New South Wales numbers there. Now, in terms of the other important aspect of financing, green bonds are really rocketing up in terms of their contributions into this market. You can see here that by 2018, or in 2018, the expectations are that green bonds issuance will be greater than $200 billion. Again, a fair bit of that's going to finance solar and to finance wind, but increasingly it's being used for other things such as water and waste and building applications as well. So just to sum up here, energy markets, I think, are being driven by 2 key trends. One is the fall in price of renewables, and really importantly, I think the tumbling price of batteries, which makes renewables more viable. Australia has a new energy policy at the moment. It's designed to meet Australia's Paris targets. It's also designed to keep prices as low as possible, and reliability has been a very important thing as well. The Australian banks are still lending to fossil fuels, but they've ceased lending to domestic coal mines and coal-fired generators. And the last point I'd make here in this summary is that climate bond issuance is growing very rapidly. The latest intelligence I have is that the demand for climate bonds is growing so strongly the capital markets people are actually talking about putting a margin into the pricing of climate bonds because they say, oh, these things are more difficult to administer. I think that just represents supply outstripping demand. So that's the end of my presentation, and I hope you all got something from that.
Thank you very much, Mr. Rob Henderson. That an interesting presentation. You share with us about global trend in energy market, specifically about Australia's national energy guarantee policy, and finally you share about the investors switching away from fossil fuels and also a strong growth in global green bonds. Thank you very much. Now I would like to invite our second speakers, Mr. Sai Ahmad Sai Mustafa, to present on the green bonds, green sukuk. Mr. Sai Ahmad, the time is yours.
Okay, thank you very much, Vishal. Greetings from Kuala Lumpur. I'm Syed representing the Malaysian Green Technology Corporation, or Green Tech Malaysia, as we also know. Thank you to ASEAN Center for Energy. It is indeed an honor for me to be some of the work that we're financing. Just a brief introduction. Green Tech Malaysia is the implementing agency of the Ministry of Energy, Green Technology and Water Malaysia. The organization was established in 1998 as the Energy Center.
Sorry to interrupt, Mr. Sai Ahmad. We haven't seen your slides presentation yet. Maybe you click on the show screen.
It's already up. Yeah. Where do I click? Hello? Vishal, it's already up. Hello? Okay, just continue.
Okay. I haven't seen your slide yet, so I will share my screen again to you.
Okay.
One more time. Yes.
Yep.
Okay. We see your slide.
Okay. Good. Great. Okay. Let me just start again. Okay. Where was I? Okay. I was introducing the Green Tech Malaysia, which is the implementing agency of the Ministry of Energy, Green Technology and Water. As I said, the organization was established in 1998 as the Energy Center for Malaysia, primarily a research organization in the areas of renewable energy and energy efficiency. In 2010, we were restructured to become Green Tech Malaysia, with a new role of catalyzing the adoption of green technology in the country. And this is in line with the establishment of the National Green Technology Policy in 2009. The main focus areas are the energy sector, building, transport, waste, and water sectors. And today I will share on the work that we have done in the area of green financing and how this has enabled the development of green technology in the country. Okay, the building that you see in the slide is where our office is housed. It's in actual fact the first platinum certified green building in Malaysia, known as the Green Office Building. It was built in construction in 2007, and it was the first of its kind at that time. The building was a pilot project to showcase the adoption of sustainable building concept with a design that integrates renewable energy and energy efficiency. Okay, this is just to show how much savings as compared to a conventional building of the same size. For example, for the month of April, we only paid about 4,000 ringgit in electricity bill, which is only about 10% of what would it cost for a conventional building. So the same also applies to water. So a lot of savings there. Okay, one of the enablers that was introduced to develop the adoption of green technology and green growth was the introduction of the Green Technology Financing Scheme, or we also call it GTFS. The scheme was established in 2010, and Green Tech Malaysia was entrusted to promote and implement the scheme by assessing eligible projects prior to the applications to the participating financial institutions. The scheme ended last year in 2017 upon R1 billion. The GTFS is actually a loan guarantee scheme and was established by the government to promote investments in green technology. It provides easy access to financing from banks and financial institutions for companies that embark on green businesses and green projects. So under the scheme, the government provides a guarantee of 60% of the financing amount given by the banks and a rebate of 2% per annum on the interest charged by these banks. It was introduced as a measure to mitigate financial risk, as during that time, green businesses were viewed as, still in fact viewed as high risk by the banks. The 60% guarantee provides comfort for the banks to finance green projects, while the 2% subsidy will reduce financing costs, thus improving the project cash flow. Okay, next slide. Okay, this chart shows the performance of GTFS since its inception. There were a lot of challenges during that time getting banks to participate when the scheme was first introduced in 2010, as banks during that time were not familiar with green technology and green businesses, which made them very complex. The government guarantee. However, in the year 2012, it gained momentum when we saw a spike of financing approvals, partly due to the introduction of another incentive, which is the feed-in tariff mechanism, governed by the Renewable Energy Act that obligates the utility company to purchase the power produced at a premium rate under a long-term renewable energy power purchase agreement. When the scheme ended in 2017 last year, it has supported 319 projects with total financing approvals reaching its target of 3.5 billion. And the largest beneficiary of the scheme are the renewable energy companies, especially the solar FIT projects. A total of 185 solar projects have so far benefited from the scheme. Okay, next slide. This shows the expected impact. So far, the scheme had gained the support of 28 banks and financial institutions, financing 319 projects, and upon completion of all these projects, the scheme would contribute into the economy of more than 7 billion ringgit in green investments, creating more than 5,000 green skilled jobs, and most importantly for the environment, the carbon reduction of more than go to the next slide. Okay, recognizing the success of the GTFS in empowering the emerging green businesses in the country and in continuing the effort to accelerate the development of green technology, we are introducing the GTFS 2.0, which is an enhancement of the previous GTFS with added new features. With a high target of 5 billion in financing approvals, the scheme is expected to continue for another 5 years. And one of the main proposed added features of the scheme is to include green sukuk and green bonds as a mode for financing. I think this is very timely in view of the fact that most of the banks in Malaysia have exhausted or nearly exhausted their single limit exposure to the main power distributor, which is the Tenaga Nasional Berhad or TNB. So the introduction of the green sukuk will provide investors and institutional investors the opportunity to participate in the scheme, helping to boost the development of green technology, contributing to the conservation of the environment. There are some basic fundamentals, differences between the sukuk and the bonds. Similar to the conventional bonds, except for the fact that a sukuk complies to the principles of Sharia or Islamic religious law. Islamic law prohibits the charging of interest, or we call it riba. I can dwell a bit more on this when doing the questions and answer session. So what then is the green sukuk? So as for the green sukuk, it is a new green Islamic bond where the proceeds are used mainly to fund specific environmentally sustainable infrastructure projects or green projects. And looking at the global sukuk market on the graph, it can be seen that the global sukuk market had displayed a rebound in the year 2016 after 3 consecutive years of decline following its peak in 2012. The global sukuk issuance recorded a growth of 13.2% from previous year to reach $74.8 billion, and Malaysia had continued to be the main driver for sukuk issuance for the year, commanding a market share of 46.4% of the total issuances. But then where's the green sukuk? Well, from the recent slowdown, Islamic banks are pushing forward to explore possibilities and opportunities for sustainable growth. And one such area is the green sukuk. And the green sukuk didn't come to being until last year in 2017, when the inaugural issuance of the world's first green sukuk was made by Tadau Energy Sdn Bhd in July 2017 in the amount of 250 million ringgit. The proceeds are used to finance a solar farm with a capacity of 50 megawatts, and the project is part of the large-scale solar program introduced by the Malaysian government, where selection of potential developers are being done through a competitive bidding framework. With these precedents that has been set, more had followed, and subsequently in October 2017, another company, Quantum Solar Park Malaysia Sdn Bhd, issued at this time the world's largest green sukuk, worth 1 billion ringgit during that time, to finance the construction of 3 large-scale 17 Pemuda National Berhad through its subsidiary PNB Malacca Ventures Sdn Bhd, announced to raise a 15-year, 10-year secured unrated green sukuk program up to 2 billion ringgit, and the company would use the proceeds to fund an 83-story green office space in Kuala Lumpur. And then in January of this year, Budayaya Group Berhad, through its subsidiary Sinar Kamiri Sdn Bhd, raised 245 million green sukuk to build a large-scale solar photovoltaic plant of 49 megawatts. And in April this year, University Technology Mara has emerged as the first institute of higher learning in the world to issue a green sukuk worth about 222.3 million ringgit to develop a 50 megawatt solar plant. To make it conducive for the green sukuk to grow, the Malaysian government had introduced a number of incentives. This include tax deductions on the issuance of costs for green sukuk approved or authorized by the Securities Commission, and also tax incentives for green technology activities. In addition to that, a grant which is tax-free is given to defray independent third-party review costs. Increase in demand for both energy and energy financing in Malaysia, and this has opened up a room in which green sukuk can grow. This is in view of the fact that the government has put in place a renewable energy generation target of 7,200 megawatts by the year of 2020. And also, there is a growing awareness on sustainable and responsible investment among conventional as well as Muslim investors. And as such, the green sukuk facilitates and increases the broader participation of conventional investors that are looking for more ethical and socially responsible investment opportunities. With that, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mustafa. That quite impressive presentation. You share a lot with us today, especially on policy support mechanism for green investments in Malaysia. Also, a clear elaboration about the basic difference between the sukuk and bonds, especially on the green sukuk in Malaysia. And finally, you share about green sukuk issuance Malaysia. Now, I would like to invite our panelists to lead the discussion and also Q&A sessions. Ms. Erika, please.
Hello, good afternoon, everyone. I am Elrika Hamdi. I'm an energy finance analyst from the Institute for Energy Economics and Financial Analysis, AIFA. If any of you is interested in energy policy and transitions of fossil fuel energy into renewables, you can check our website, which is So first of all, thank you, Vizel, and thank you, the ASEAN Center for Energy, for having me as a panelist today. And thank you, Rob and Mr. Shahid Ahmad, both for the very interesting presentations. I really like reading your presentations. I would like to provide several comments first before throwing some questions to both presenters. First of all, I find it fascinating that despite having the fourth largest coal reserves in the world, Australia managed to push itself faster on transitioning from coal to renewable, as presented in Rob's slides. And this is very much on the opposite of the Indonesian government's decision, unfortunately, currently. I found that although Indonesia is not included as the top 10 list country who has the coal reserves, but we do still have abundant of them, especially for thermal coal, and the government somehow still insists that coal should be the development capital of the country. And by development capital here, I mean that coal is considered as the main resource, not only for the state revenues or profitability of the companies, but also coal is to accelerate the process of Indonesian industrialization, which includes a target for downstreaming the metal and mineral industry. So this is what I found during the Coal Trans conference in May. And in short, the Indonesian government still prefers the outdated, dirty, but cheap coal over the renewable energy technology. But of course, the cheap part, as mentioned by Rob in his presentations, is not applicable anymore, or at least will not be applicable for a longer term. The two key global trends that was shown where the renewable energy prices, such as solar and wind, are becoming less and less by months even, is an important factor for the ASEAN countries as much as to Australia. The fact that the battery storage price is following this trend will no doubt help some of the countries in ASEAN, including the Indonesian government debate on preferring coal over renewable, and that preference for coal becomes even more irrational as it's not cheap anymore. So, however, I would like to add more to that, I think there is a third, or rather fourth, global trend that takes the fight of energy transition into a real game changer, and that is, from my observation, as the more prominent health and environmental campaign that has taken place all over the world, notwithstanding the Australia, but also in China, in Vietnam, in the US, and these campaigns somehow managed to attract a lot of attention, not only from the environmentalist groups, but also by heavily involving the communities. It somehow attracts the policymakers and business leaders' attention. And I have heard a lot of complaints from the coal industry players where they are currently trapped by all of these campaigns, and they're starting to think that, maybe coal is not going to last anymore, or renewable certainly will take a lot more sense. So they are thinking of diversifying their business into renewable. This is also, I think, probably one of the biggest factors which changed the mindset of the leading Australian banks to rule out lending to new coal mines. So it will be interesting to hear Rob's opinion on this later on. The second comment that I would like to insert from reading these two fantastic presentations is the fact that green bond or green sukuk has indeed led a new chapter for bond investors to be more vigilant toward projects that would harm the environment. However, from what I observed so far, especially in the case of Indonesia, many players or project sponsors in this case, or even the government probably, is not aware that bonds are the more expensive tools compared to traditional financing such as bank loans. Plus, the bond investors are usually not very keen to finance greenfield projects. Most will prefer the brownfield projects who are already under constructions or almost operational, or even most bond investors will choose more to those who issue bonds for refinancing instead of basing it for a new project. And bonds also has a minimum size that is, especially international bonds, they usually have to be at least a USD 250 millions. And sometimes this size and the cost is not attractive, or it's not an attractive solution for small and medium players. So again, taking the case of Indonesia or maybe in other countries as well, we don't really have that many shovel ready projects. We don't have that many projects with good and decent bankability and returns. And also, if I may say, there might be even more small and medium projects compared to big ones. So bonds or sukuk might not have been the preferred solution for this. Having said that, it was interesting that the Malaysia's green sukuk issuance were for greenfield projects. I saw that some of them are for solar farm. So most banks, according to Mr. Syed Ahmad, in Malaysia have or are exhausted or have exhausted most of their financing capability for the power generation. Hence, issuing sukuk is a good alternative. So I'm interested to hear from Mr. Syed Ahmad's opinion for the case of Malaysia. How do you think a good or creative financing should be structured for the small and medium players, for those who probably have projects below, say, 20 megawatts or 10 megawatts? Also, I'm very much interested to hear more on the policy support mechanism, the green tech financing scheme that Malaysia have implemented. I wonder if you have any data on how much or what is the NPL rate, the non-performing loan rate of these projects since implemented from 2010, and if there has been any complete project failure that the Malaysian government encountered, and if there is a project failure that did not get built, how does the government deal with the guarantee scheme? So I guess I will leave the 3 questions for now. So one is for Rob, for his opinion on the biggest factor that changed the mindset of the leading banks in Australia to rule out lending to new coal mines. The second one is for Mr. Syed Ahmad on how do you think a good or creative financing should be structured for small and medium players. And the third one is also for Mr. Syed Ahmad, if there, how much of the non-performing rates, the NPL rate for the projects using the green tech financing scheme, and if there is any failure project or failed projects, and how did the government deal with that? Thank you for now.
Will I start by answering the question that was put to me?
Sure.
Okay, so I guess to start with, Elrica, I think we met in Jakarta when I was there in March. That's correct, isn't it? Anyway, I thought I met someone from IEFA when I was there. So I'd just like to answer to your question about the Australian banks. Yes, it's true that the community did put a lot of pressure on the banks, particularly activists that were trying to reduce coal usage in the Australian economy. That's true, and people did sign up to go and ask their banks not to invest any further in fossil fuels, particularly in coal. So I do think that's a very good point you made, and I think that community involvement certainly weighed on the banks. And if you like, accelerated their decision making. There's no doubt about that. But I'd also say that the bank's movement away from fossil fuels and towards a more carbon neutral environment started quite a long time ago. When I was working at National Australia Bank, I can remember now 3 managing directors ago, so that was a fellow called John Stewart, came in, must have been about 2008 or 2009, I think, and said that he wanted to make National Australia Bank 100% carbon free, which they proceeded to do for the bank's own operations. So, you know, the idea that we should be moving away from a carbon economy has quite a long history now amongst the banks. But the other important development, I think, has been the regulators are now talking to the banks and saying to them that it's their responsibility to manage the risks surrounding climate change, both the risks to companies that are on their books and what that might mean for the banks themselves, the underlying riskiness of their own bank lending books, and secondly, the risks that they face from potentially changes in policy. And at the moment, the opposition in Australia has a policy of moving to 45% target for emissions reductions by 2030 if they're elected. So, you know, that is a significant risk for banks, and I think those sort of risks and the regulator talking about them has been important. But the third thing is just the economics, and I've talked about the economics, but certainly, you know, the charts show you the banks aren't silly. They can see that the cheap available energy in the future is going to come from renewables. They don't want to be investing in old technology that's going to be under threat and under pressure. They want new, fast-growing industries. So I think that's part of the reason they're moving ahead. And just one last comment I'll make. In your introduction, Ulrika, you were talking about Indonesia and if you like, they're still very wedded to coal there. And certainly when I was in Jakarta earlier this year, I got that very same impression. I think that the reason that's happening is because in Indonesia, private firms and policymakers aren't actually seeing the true costs, the levelised costs of the various technologies. That's because coal usage is subsidised in Indonesia, so it looks cheaper than it really is. And secondly, there is an implicit tax on the use of renewables because it's considered to be infrastructure and you have to have 40% local content. Effectively, that means that Indonesia is denying itself low-cost solar panels, for example, from China. So I think the problem that Indonesia is facing, in a sense, is that people think that coal-fired power stations are cheaper, and they actually are if you do the numbers, but the problem is the taxes and subsidies are hiding the true underlying costs. So that's actually a cost for the Indonesian economy. I think that's the end of my comments there.
Okay, yes. Thank you so much, Rob. I was muted automatically by the by the application, I guess. So it's really interesting that you say about the local content and the true cost of coal, which is not understood well by the government or private sector. I agree with you a lot, especially on the local content for the solar sector. And we are, well, I am trying to write something about it in the future months. So hopefully this levelized cost, the real levelized cost of energy, as well as the risk associated with this implicit tax on the local content will be more thoroughly analyzed. But thank you for that. And can I give the floor to Mr. Shahid Ahmad now?
Hello? Okay, I was muted just now by the organizer.
Okay. Yes, okay.
Okay, okay. Let me address the question. Firstly, on the small players, what kind of innovative financing mechanism that is available. Well, I would think the green technology financing scheme is very suitable for this. In 2010 up to 2017, 92% of the recipients are made up of SMEs. So when the scheme was introduced, it was designed to suit the SMEs. It's only later on when now when we look at GTFS 2.0, we want to expand it to larger scale kind of projects when we include the green sukuks. And as far as tax incentive is concerned, apart from this financing incentive, the government had also introduced what they call is green investment tax allowance, as well as green income tax exemptions. The investment tax allowance is mainly for, excuse me, it's mainly for projects and assets, green assets that are being deployed for the project. And the income tax exemptions are mainly for the green services that is being provided. Okay, as far as the NPL rate, of course, like in any bank financing, there is NPL, and there's about 10 to 12% the rate of NPL, and basically not because of the project that failed, but mainly because management of the project. We have incidences of fraud where the directors siphon off the money somewhere. So mainly for that reason that we have this problem. And when you talked about the pros and cons on loans and bonds, yes, there are pros and cons. When it depends on what is the requirement of the project developer, whether to go for bonds or for loans. And of course, if you look at the bank loans, it's very tied to the company's assets, debentures and all that, and there's a lot of requirement and covenants that they need to comply with, and in comparison to bonds, it's a bit more flexible. But of course, the initial cost for bond issuance is a little bit more expensive, higher than bank financing. Yes, I think have I answered all the questions, Erica?
Okay, just to
Yes.
add more, thank you,
Thank you.
Mr. Samad. There are two questions from our audiences. The first one is, are green bond issues gradually replacing project financing scheme? What will be the role of ECAs for this? I think this question should go to Mr. Rob Henderson. And one more question to Mr. Ahmad. What do you think about the acceptance of financing institution in Malaysia, and any possible to expand it to other ASEAN countries? So first, I would like to invite Rob to answer the first questions.
Okay, thanks, Faisal. The first of those questions about the question was, are green bonds gradually replacing lending? I think the answer to that is probably not. I mean, the original use of green bonds, and I'm very familiar with green bonds that have been issued in Australia, but I think it's fairly true globally. The green bonds originated from the major banks in Australia, and what was happening there was that the banks were funding using project finance, things like wind farms and solar farms and so on, and they do 2 or 3 of these, or 4 or 5 or 6 of these projects. Then they would package those loans up and turn them into a bond, which they would then sell off to investors, thereby creating some more space on their balance sheets, effectively giving the risk to the investors, who got a long run return, because a lot of these assets have long runs. So insurance companies, for example, love these sorts of investments, as do funds that have long liability trains, and they have investors that want to invest in green things. So the banks themselves are using these bonds as a way of getting project finance deals off their books to make more room to do more finance deals. So that's where they originated from. Now, of course, large large investors, international organisations such as the World Bank is a good example, use green bonds directly to raise money and then fund projects. So that is happening as well. So I see them working in tandem rather than the green bonds replacing project finance. Certainly, green bonds can be used by investors as an individual way of funding particular large-scale energy projects, but they're also, I think, will continue to be used by banks and other financial institutions in order to try and clear their project finance book so they can do more business. And can you just explain to me the second question, please, Vissel? I didn't catch the second part.
The second question is what will be the role of ECAs for this scheme?
And I don't know what that means. What is?
I think the ECA is mean export credit agencies.
Oh, the export credit agencies.
Yeah, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah. Look, I'm going to pass on that one, Vissel. I'm not sure. I'm not an expert on export credit agencies. I mean, I know they're active in the financing space for some particular projects, but I'm not an expert on it, so I prefer not to answer that one, if that's okay.
That's fine. Then we will pass the question to Mr. Ahmad and also Ms. Erika to lead the discussion. Thank you.
Okay, Vissel, what was the question? I didn't quite get the question. Hello?
Hello, do you hear me?
Yes. What was the question?
Yeah. Okay, the question,
that was
the first one is, what do you think about the acceptance of financing institution in Malaysia?
The acceptance of financing institution?
Yeah, in Malaysia.
Mm-hmm.
And the second one, any possibility to expand it to other Asian country?
Oh, okay.
Okay, and one question from Rob as well. No, from our Dan as well, is what will be the role of ECA? If I'm not mistaken, it means Export Credit Agency.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Well, talking about the ECAs, export credit agencies, most of the ECAs, they represent the country that they want to for the, and for some companies that are embarked on projects outside their shores, outside their border, then ECAs can facilitate that and can be a great help to these developers. For example, in Malaysia, we have the Export-Import Bank, Exim Bank, that does this. And if I'm not mistaken, there are also in Australia, Japan, China, as well as Italy, France. They all have their own ECA to support the financing of the developers to export the expertise and projects overseas. On the question of the acceptance of financial institutions, whether this can be extended to projects outside Malaysia, okay, for the GTFS, it's one of the basic requirements is that the projects must be located in Malaysia. So for the GTFS, it is not possible to finance projects outside Malaysia. But however, as I mentioned just now, we have the Exim Bank of Malaysia, which can support projects outside Malaysia, and it can, I mean, the borrowers can use the GTFS to import or to prepare or to fabricate some of the components of the projects in Malaysia, right, with the intention of export. So that can be done. Thank you. I hope that clearly answered the question.
Okay, Miss Erika, please continue the discussions if you have any comment.
Okay. Well, I think I have another question for Rob. a simple one actually. I'm interested in the mechanism plan to implement the Australian energy guarantee policy. Can you elaborate this a little bit, Rob? And by the way, yes, it was me that you met in Indonesia last March, I guess.
Okay, thanks very much, Erica. And that was it was very pleasant meeting you, and I remember that meeting very well. So I was certain it was you. So thank you very much for confirming that. Look, the Australian. So very quickly, what's happening in Australia is that we have had, and you know, I'm embarrassed to say this, but changing energy policy nearly every government we've had since about 2010. Which has led to substantial underinvestment in the overall electricity generation and distribution networks over that period. And it's causing problems in terms of blackouts and so on. So the federal government is trying to come up with a way of encouraging investment and meeting its other obligations without putting a price on carbon. So that's because a number of conservative members of the government. Many of you will have heard of Tony Abbott, who's a previous Prime Minister in the Liberal Party. These people are very pro-coal. Some people call them the pro-coal lobby in Canberra, and they want to ensure that Australia continues to have coal-fired power stations. So this National Energy Guarantee seems to be a very complicated way of avoiding anything that's prescriptive. So basically, it's got three objectives. The first objective is to meet our Paris climate change obligations, which are to cut emissions by 26 to 28%. They're shooting on the low side, by the way, 26% by 2030. They're doing that by saying that all new generation must be consistent with that target. So that's the first part of it. The second part of it is something they call a National Energy Guarantee. That means that all suppliers of electricity, all new generating capacity, must be able to supply electricity on demand, not all their total capacity, but some of it has to be on demand. Now that's led to the need, I think, for wind farms and solar farms to have battery storage, basically, and that battery storage could be hydro. So AGL, which is a large energy company in Australia, they're going to put in a new power plant on the current Liddell power station site in the Hunter Valley, and they're experimenting with pumped hydro in old coal mines as a way of ensuring supply. So that's the second thing, reliability guarantee. The third thing is low cost. So they're trying not to be prescriptive in order to try and keep the rising cost of electricity to Australian households and businesses and industry down. So all of these three things are being put together. The Labor Party has said, look, if you introduce this, we're prepared to run with the mechanism, but we will increase the emissions target from 26% to 45%. Now that's all doable under this framework. So it remains to be seen whether or not that will happen. Most of the generation is done under the auspices of the state governments. They have control, and the government will need all the state governments to sign off on this National Energy Guarantee to get it up. So as I say, it's in the balance at the moment, but at least it looks like a way ahead for Australia.
Thank you very much, Mr. Rob Henderson, because of the time. So now I would like to conclude this webinar's discussions. So for others questions, it will be answered by our speakers and will be posted in our website. So to close my sessions on this webinars, all the informations and publications will be posted on our website. So presentation and video recording of these webinars, and also the question that we'll receive from our audiences will also be responded by our speakers and will be posted there. So feel free to come back and see the information in our website, www.aseanenergy.org. And if you have any feedback, please contact us at this email on the screen. For now, I conclude the discussion in our webinar today. Our highest appreciation. Thank you so much, Mr. Rob Henderson, Mr. Ahmad Sai Mustafa, and Ms. Erika Hamdi. Thank you very much for all the audiences who joined with us. I'm very proud and very pleased to inform you that we conduct our webinar regularly every month. So thank you, and see you again in our upcoming webinar next month. Thank you all.
Thank you very much, Faisal.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank
Have a
you.
good day.
You too.